Chris Rock arrived at the studio in a sharp jacket, energy buzzing around him like static. His voice could be heard before he turned the corner, firing off jokes with surgical precision, shaking hands, slapping back, signing the hallway. Stephen Colbert was reviewing cue cards at his desk, already aware this would not be a smooth ride. Chris Rock was a firecracker with no off switch, and tonight the match was already lit. The showrunner whispered warnings. The producers exchanged glances. They had booked a storm dressed like comedy and hoped it would play by the rules, but everyone knew Rock never read the rules. The show began like clockwork. Stephen made his usual entrance, smile, sincere suit, perfect monologue, crisp, and crowd warmed up to every beat. Then came the big guest introduction. The name alone caused the crowd to erupt as Chris Rock stepped onto the stage, his walk cocky, his grin wide. Stephen greeted him with cautious charm, and the two sat down with a cheer still echoing off the walls. Chris wasted no time and launched into an improvised rant about everything from politics to pop culture, slicing through topics with no filter. Stephen laughed politely, but tension was already blooming like ink in water. Stephen tried to guide the conversation into familiar territory, asking about Chris' latest comedy special, but Rock twisted the question into a sharp commentary on cancel culture, hypocrisy, and censorship. He said, "You can't be brave and scared at the same time. Either you say it or you don't." Clap for courage and cry at the punchline. The audience gave a mixed response. Some laughed, others winced. Stephen smiled tightly and said that freedom of speech did not mean freedom from consequence. Chris leaned forward and said, "Consequence is fine, but fake outrage is performance art in disguise." The crowd reacted with uncertain noise, and Stephen changed lanes again, asking about Chris' thoughts on the state of late-night television. Chris laughed and said, "Late night is dead. It's just Twitter with a couch now, and the only risk is spilling your drink." Stephen tried to pivot, but Chris interrupted, saying, "The problem with you shows is you wanna be like Too Bad. Truth don't come with applause." Stephen blinked, looked at his notes, then back at Chris, and said, "There is a difference between telling truth and torching bridges. Some comedians forget that fire spreads even when they mean well." Chris raised an eyebrow and said, "Yeah, and some hosts act like priests, pretending the desk is a pulpit, like jokes need permission slips." Now Stephen chuckled, but the laugh was hollow, and replied, "The difference between fearless and reckless is whether you care who gets hit." Chris said, "Maybe if people got hit more they'd learn to duck." The room split in half, applause and tension wrestling on the air. Stephen said, "Hurting people doesn't make the truth more powerful, it makes it easier to ignore." And Chris shot back, saying, "Soft truth is just sugar-coated silence, no thanks." The heat was unmistakable. Stephen adjusted in his chair, still trying to steer back into comedy, asking about Chris' experience at a recent awards show. Chris smirked and said, "Man, awards shows are just political campaigns in tuxedos." He mocked the phony speeches and polished masks, adding that nobody in Hollywood says what they mean anymore, just what tests well with sponsors. Stephen laughed but moved to defend the industry, saying many creatives still strive for honesty and art even under pressure. Chris replied, "Yeah, but pressure reveals cracks, not character, and some people are just polished plastic with microphones." Stephen attempted to lighten the moment with the planned gag, pulling out a prop from under his desk, a toy microphone wrapped in velvet meant to mock how soft comedy had become. Chris looked at it, then said, "Man, that's exactly the problem, making a joke about the problem without admitting you're part of it." He leaned in and said, "If you gonna throw stones, don't hide your hands." Stephen dropped the smile and said, "We invite guests, not interrogators." And Chris said, "You want safe stories, not real voices. I came to speak, not to rehearse your comfort zone routine." The tension snapped. The audience was quiet. Stephen said, "Maybe this isn't the space for you if respect isn't on the table." And Chris said, "Maybe your table was never big enough for real talk anyway." They both stood, Chris faster than Stephen. The chair scraped the floor harshly. Chris turned to the crowd and said, "Funny how truth makes people nervous and everyone acts like it's my volume, not the message, that rattles them." Stephen pointed to the wings and said, "You're done here." And Chris smiled, shook his head, and walked off stage. No wave, no goodbye, just fire in his step. The cameras cut away quickly and producers scrambled to patch the segment. Stephen returned after the break, composed but clearly shaken. He addressed the audience, saying, "Comedy should challenge, not collapse. That we bring people here to speak, not to shatter civility, but sometimes lines get crossed and we have to respond in the moment." The audience applauded softly, more from uncertainty than agreement. Online clips spread within minutes, trending across platforms, half the world cheering Rock, the other half defending Colbert, everyone choosing sides like it was a championship, not a conversation gone volcanic. Chris left the studio immediately. No press, no apology, just a cryptic tweet later that night that said, "If truth makes you sweat, maybe it ain't the lights," followed by a mic drop emoji. Stephen said nothing publicly for 2 days, then issued a statement saying, "We believe in free expression but also in boundaries that protect the integrity of respectful exchange." Fans argued all over forums, comment sections flooded with hot takes, intellectuals, comedians, critics and keyboard warriors all dissecting what was said and how it was said and whether truth had a tone limit or just bad timing. Podcasts lit up overnight, debates unfolded everywhere. Was Chris Rock a rogue artist speaking uncomfortable truths, or a grenade disguised as a guest? Was Colbert too brittle, or simply protecting the space he curated for decades? Was this a meltdown or a message? Was it comedy or was it a war on politeness that finally boiled over? Analysts called it the collision of two media eras, one born from edge, the other born from nuance, both clashing on a carpeted stage where millions watched in real time and saw more than just a late night spat. They saw a fracture in the format. Other comedians weighed in, some siding with Chris, saying hosts play gatekeeper, too often controlling the tone like hall monitors. Others defended Stephen, saying his stage, his rules, and without some order chaos pretends to be freedom. The argument grew legs and soon people stopped caring about who was right and started wondering why honesty and harm were now neighbors, why every joke needed a warning and every guest became a gamble. What happened to the middle ground door? Had it always been shrinking, just now finally exposed by two men with microphones and mindset like steel? Months passed, but the incident echoed. Still think pieces, documentaries and even university lectures use the segment as a cultural landmark, a moment when civility and candor had no translator, when humor and harm could not shake hands, and when the stage cracked not from drama but from friction. Chris continued his tour unbothered, his material sharper than ever, leaning into the chaos, embracing the storm he had stirred. Stephen refined his bookings more carefully, more measured but also more personal. Something in him had shifted, as if he realized the space between comfort and cowardice was thinner than he liked. Later in an interview, Stephen said, "Sometimes the show teaches you more than any guest ever could. Sometimes discomfort is the real feedback." He said, "Chris Rock is brilliant, no question, but brilliance without breaks can burn the very bridge it tries to build." Chris, on the other hand, in a special months later, said, "If you don't like the kitchen, don't invite the chef." And people laughed, but they also listened, because now everything he said came with the weight of that night, not just comedy but confrontation, a reminder that truth is funny until it isn't anymore. So the moment lived on not as a scandal but as a signal, a reminder that performance is not always polite and truth is not always quiet, and when you mix fire with fabric something tears. The stage recovered, but the audience had changed. No one watched the same way again. Now they leaned in a little more, waited for the smile to fade, listened for the moment when the jokes stopped being safe and started being real, because deep down they all knew what had happened on that night was not a mistake, it was a mirror, and nobody looks in one without flinching.